welcome to our event on the long-term sustainability of outer space. So how to ensure the long-term sustainability of outer space, the role of space law and policy. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome a number of well-known prominent speakers, experts in the field, and which have come together at the margins of the COPOS ongoing since yesterday in Vienna. It has just ended at 5 p.m. So we are now here directly afterwards, almost all in Vienna. So some speakers are in Vienna, some are not in Vienna, but we are connected via the internet, and that makes it possible to have this event. I also welcome quite a number of speakers from different countries, which also take this opportunity. Thank you very much and welcome. I would like to give the floor now to Viktoria Schebeck for some introductory remarks. Unfortunately, Margit Mischkulnik, the head of the Department for Space Affairs at the Austrian Ministry for Climate Action, cannot join us for a short notice important meeting, but she welcomes us and wishes us all the best for the event. But now Viktoria Schebeck, who is the lawyer in the department, please, I invite you for your introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Professor Margot, and a warm welcome to everyone also from my side. As been said, my name is Viktoria Schebeck, and I work for the Department for Space Affairs at the Ministry for Climate Action, Environment, Energy, Mobility, Innovation and Technology, a very long name, so the short name is BMK. As said, I'm stepping in for my head of department today, Margit Mischkulnik. The BMK, which serves as the Space Ministry in Austria, has supported the National Point of Contact space law since its establishment in 2001, first at the University of Graz and since 2008 at the University of Vienna. Austria has always had a strong focus and interest in space law and policy, and we are very proud that the Office for Outer Space Affairs is located at the UN headquarters in Vienna, and also that the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space takes place in Vienna every year. Space technology and space-based data have become indispensable in our daily lives, and space data and services can help us fight one of the biggest crises of our times, the climate crisis. The space sector is also an innovation driver and is currently growing strongly. Globally, around 76 billion euros was invested in space activities by the public sector and around 7 billion euro by the private sector in 2020. Compared to 2019, public investment has increased by 8% and private investment even by 30%. While Europe's space budget remains well below that of the US, NASA alone has a budget twice as high as all European and national space programs combined. Europe has caught up with the top by setting strategic priorities and has even taken the lead in some sectors. This has also fueled private investment in Europe with a 167% increase from 2019 to 2020 alone. With more space activities, though, orbits are becoming more and more congested and contested. To ensure the long-term use of outer space, we must act together on the UN level to find means and ways, such as the long-term sustainability guidelines and a potential framework for space traffic management to keep space sustainable. Austria has published its new space strategy called People, Climate and Economy, Spaces for Everyone, in October last year. The Austrian space strategy describes 6 strategic goals we want to reach until 2030 and beyond. And one of these goals concerns sustainable development on Earth and in space. We want to use our expertise and demonstrate how space technologies can help reach the goal of sustainability, thereby contributing to a green and digital transformation. And the other 5 goals, they concern a competitive space sector with a high degree of value added and sustainable jobs in Austria, scientific excellence in space and Earth research, space for all areas of life, and what we also need are talents and diversity for space, as well as a public dialogue on space. In particular, Austria aims to become a pioneer in supporting sustainable development on Earth, and in what is more important for today's topic, also in space. Besides introducing sustainability indicators for national space activities, we aim at establishing a new core topic, space and sustainability, at the European Space Policy Institute, which is located in Vienna. In addition, we will advocate for the sustainable use of space in the context of space diplomacy, but also the greening of space law, including our own National Space Act. The event today, which is organized in collaboration with the National Point of Contact for Space Law, is a first step in that direction. Thank you very much for listening and enjoy the event.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction and also very thoughtful contribution already to the topic, and the contribution of Austria on its way to implementation of the long-term sustainability goals in outer space. Thank you very much. And now, as it says on the program, I shall give some presentation of topic or introduction of panelists. I will be very short in this, just give you an overview how this event is planned time-wise. Now, first we will start with a keynote speech on space debris by Dr. Holger Krag from the European Space Agency. Then we have the pleasure to listen to Natercia Rodrigues from the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. She will talk about the role of the UN Register for Space Objects in this context. And then Professor Mahulena Hofmann from the University of Luxembourg. Yeah, and the difference between a keynote and the contributions is that the keynote is a little longer, about 15 minutes, and the rest of the speakers, so we have then six more speakers, 10 minutes. This means we have reserved at the end half an hour for discussion, so please note down your questions or put them in the chat, and in the end, after all the presentations, we hopefully have a lively discussion where we can all incorporate your questions to the speakers. So not after every presentation we will have this time for this. Please put them together and reserve them for the end. So 10 minutes then for UNOOSA and the Register for Space Objects. Then Professor Mahulena Hofmann, she will talk as a professor of international law, have a look at the UN space treaties and the LTS guidelines, the text of those instruments, what is in there relating to sustainability already at time in the 60s and 70s of the space treaties, and now in the LTS guidelines. So highlight the sustainability aspects. Then Joanne Wheeler from the United Kingdom will talk about experiences with implementing the LTS guidelines from national perspective, the United Kingdom. It's a pleasure that Tanja Masson-Zwaan will share with us some of the ideas and goals of the Spaceways project, which is a research project supported by the EU in its Horizon 2020 program. And Tanja is a member of this consortium, and the University of Leiden is a member of the consortium, and Tanja is their assistant professor. So we're looking very much forward to this. We will hear about it. It's central is space traffic management. And so the connection between long-term sustainability and space traffic management will probably come through this presentation. And the last two presentations are again devoted to implementation of LTS guidance at the national level, which is very important. And we have the pleasure to welcome Jean-François Mayence from Belgium to talk about the Belgian perspective, and Dr. Ryan Giulietta from the Department of State of the United States to talk about the implementation of the 21 UN guidelines in the United States. So it's a great pleasure to have such a really experienced and interesting group of speakers here. And I would like to give now the floor to our keynote speaker, Holger Krag.
Thanks so much, Professor Mabel, for inviting me and for giving me the honor of having even a keynote, which I enjoy a lot. So you will see that I present the Space to be Challenged through the eye of an engineer. That's what I am. But you will also see there are many crossroads of that problem when we are coming into space law matters and policy matters. So I will put a particular emphasis on this. But let's start from the beginning. What you see here are all objects, man or human-made, I should say, in space with a limiting size of at least 1 meter. These are about 6,000 objects. And these are all objects larger than 10 centimeter. And here we're talking about 30,000 objects. So it's the size of the smartphone here that I have. And it coincides with the size of the object that we can also track and follow from ground. So we know they are there. And even more important, we will know where will they be, because that's important, obviously, for operations. These are all objects above 1 centimeter size. And here we're talking about 1 million. And obviously, most of them we cannot see. They're just too small. But we know they are there because we know how they are produced and we know the mechanisms behind their generation. And therefore, we can assess their number. And likewise, also for the objects above 1 millimeter size, 150 million. To remind you, an object of 1 millimeter at orbital velocities impacting on a spacecraft can cause significant harm to a spacecraft. An object of 1 centimeter size impacting on a spacecraft in orbit can kill the mission. It will not be no longer functional. And an object of 10 centimeter size will not only kill the mission, but will even destroy the spacecraft and shatter it into pieces with a contaminating effect for the environment and therefore all others. The danger is real. We do see impacts even in our ESA missions or the missions we fly for the European Commission. The Copernicus spacecraft that you see here has been hit by an object of just 2 millimeter size, and that impact came from behind, leaving a crater behind of diameter of 40 centimeter that you see here, and producing fragments out of the solar array that are big enough to be seen by surveillance networks. Now, looking at the object that can be tracked, we do have a nice history on how the environment actually developed. If you look at the history of what had been tracked up to the current number of 30,000 objects in space today, you see two-step increases, one in 2007 and one in 2009, which are two major events that we still suffer from in the environment. Obviously, the anti-satellite test that was conducted with the Chinese weather satellite in 2007 and the unintentional collision between Cosmos and Iridium. Some spacecraft which are operating in the altitude where these events happened, they had doubled their efforts in terms of collision avoidance maneuvers because of all the additional fragments that have been added. 30,000 is what we are tracking today. When I say we, it's mainly the US space surveillance network doing this and sharing the data, but efforts in other countries, also in Europe, are on the way. In terms of mass, we are talking about 10,000 tons of on-orbit mass. And if you put all the objects together side by side, the geometric cross-section that you would get corresponds to 88,000 square meters. So everything on orbit stacked together, 88,000 square meters, that's several tennis courts of area. And that is the past. If you now look at the future, we would have to look at the trends in launching objects. And also here, we see a radical change, and that is no surprise to you. This is well known. We used to have an average launch rate of about 100 objects per year, quite constantly over the history of spaceflight, and that is now changing. You see it is now the commercialization that is triggering this change. So the orange color is commercial mission, not taxpayer funded, and the launch rate goes up by a factor of 10 to 20, and that is expected from the planned constellations that you see here. And that changes also the range between active and inactive payloads. The environment used to be dominated by non-active spacecraft, and you see now that active spacecraft, in particular in black, are coming in and catch up and even take the majority. You see that, and that makes most of these constellations are coming from North America, where this effect is in particular visible. You see that Europe is small, even if you put all countries together, is still a small contributor to space flight and also therefore to the space environment all in all. Preventing space debris, or mitigation, as we call it technically, the guidelines, technical measures for mitigating space debris are around since 20 years. They have been first developed in the 90s, and they have been documented first by the Interagency Debris Coordination Committee in 2002, so really 20 years ago. And they have been propagated into standards, and you find them also reflected in national regulation or licensing processes. There are different flavors in the different documents, but the key principles are always the same. When you operate in LEO, you should make sure that your space system, let it be an upper stage or a spacecraft, doesn't matter, is disposed in a way after the mission that it will not stay within LEO for longer than 25 years. And when this re-enters in the atmosphere, you should watch out for on-ground safety, not making sure that undue risk on ground is prevented. When you're operating in the GEO zone, it cannot be expected that you deorbit your space system completely back to Earth. That will not be possible technically. So here you may use a so-called graveyard zone far enough away from GEO where you can dispose the system permanently. For all missions, no matter in which region they fly, make sure after the mission the spacecraft and upper stage is passivated, and that means residual energy, charged batteries or fuel tanks are completely discharged, made safe, so that there's no risk for explosive breakups. And of course, if you have a propulsion module, do what you can in order to avoid collision while your mission is active. So these are the principles. And now comes what we are actually doing. This diagram shows you the number of fragmentation events that happen in orbit. So in other words, these are the explosions triggered by residual fuel, triggered by pressure tanks, or triggered by batteries, no matter what. We don't even know why an object breaks up, because you need telemetry to understand the root cause. And very often during the breakup, you lose also the telemetry, and then you can only guess what the reason was. But we are interested in the sheer number. And since these are bins of 5 years, so every bar stands for 5 years, and you have 50 on average in every 5 years, that means every year you have 10 explosions. And that is by far too much. 10 explosions every year, even in recent years. So even after the mitigation guidelines came into place, this happens. And that happens, of course, although we do mitigation, we still have cases where very often directly after launch, you have a failure, a technical failure, where you cannot communicate with your spacecraft anymore, and it's full of fuel. And even if it is designed to do mitigation, you just can't command it to execute the mitigation just because the commanding is lost because of a technical failure. So there's a problem. And of course, there are also objects exploding that have been in the environment already for some decades. We see that objects can break up that have been launched in the 60s. So that comes on top of that. A very important rule or guideline is to make sure objects get disposed. And that's an expensive measure, because after 5 or 10 years of operations, you need to have enough fuel, and you need to spend the manpower to make sure that the object is maneuvered down to lower altitude from where the object would re-enter in the atmosphere. That's an extra effort to be taken, and that's quite complex to do. And therefore, the guidelines already say we don't expect this to occur at 100% likelihood, because we know it's technically difficult. So we are saying 90% is the success rate that should be at least aimed at. But if you see what we're actually doing, and you may ask, how do we know? We are looking at surveillance data. We're looking at surveillance data, which gives us an enormous transparency of how people behave. Missing out on a disposal maneuver of that size, you cannot miss it. You will see it in the data. If something explodes, you will immediately see it in the surveillance data. So this is quite some truth data. And you see that roughly 50% of the missions that would have to do such a maneuver, only 50% manage to do so. And that is, of course, means that several dozens of objects get stranded every year. What does it mean for the environment, in particular the future of the environment? And here you can do some trending using model predictions. The curves here, they show you the number of objects that would be in the catalog, so above 10 centimeter, in the future, for the case where we do nothing at all, we just don't do anything. That would be the white curve. If we manage to suppress all the explosions by 100% successful passivation, we would cut the problem in half. The blue trend here would mean that all the explosions are successfully stopped. And that is the main problem. If we manage this, the problem would be cut by half. If we combine this with the required success rate in post-mission disposal of 90%, you could almost stop the growth. The trend would still grow, but not as dramatic and not exponentially anymore. Surprise might be for you, it will not shrink. Although we have atmospheric decay, it doesn't shrink because there are objects in the environment that collide with each other that overcompensate the atmospheric decay that we have. So we don't shrink. If you want to shrink, you need to add also active removal onto this. But if you extrapolate what we are currently doing, this mixture of doing nothing and with these many explosions that we still have, we come up with a red curve here, and that is close to doing nothing. So we need to get significantly better. In ESA, we believe a lot of this is related to technical insufficiencies. It's because we are losing objects. Technically, the function is lost, the contact is lost, even if they're designed to do all these measures. So we need to become more robust. And we are thinking of applying a so-called zero debris approach. We are not the only ones that talk about these principles. There was a Paris Peace Forum last year where a couple of entities have also signed up to similar principles. The idea is by 2030 to have the ESA missions, that's the one we have under control, so that at least the ESA missions, and don't take this as an agreed policy yet, but this is something that we are discussing at the moment very, very closely, would leave nothing behind. So we would make sure that we are disposing our own objects, which likelihood much better than 90%. Achieving 100% would be ideal, but let's not dream. These are technical systems and there will be failures. But for these failures, active removal should come in. In other words, the future ESA mission, if that policy is accepted, a future ESA mission would present already an active removal contract before it gets allowed to be launched. And that contract would have to be activated if the disposal in the 20 years later has failed. So that we have the assurance that the object will be gone, whatever it takes, either by active removal or by disposal. That is what we would call a zero debris approach. And that needs to be done in order to tighten up in order to get better in this situation. Of course, we cannot do that just like that, inventing a policy. The technology for that must be there. And no regulator will follow ESA in these steps, and even ESA will not allow us to do it if we don't demonstrate the technology for that is there and is affordable. What is the technology? You need to have the possibility for more reliable disposal. You can have separate deorbiting kits, for example, launched. You can have the onboard redundancy, and you can work on your platform, your spacecraft platform, in order to make it more reliably implement this post-mission disposal. And of course, you need to show that active removal is actually working. And that's what we are doing with the ClearSpace 1 mission. The effect of having such a zero debris policy is that it would stipulate the use of this technology and the better behavior in the disposal. And for the leftovers, it would automatically generate a market for the removal services. And it is for that reason that the ClearSpace 1 mission is conducted by a company, a startup, and a consortium, a European consortium led by the ClearSpace in Switzerland, which sees and is prepared for that market. This is not a mission for ESA. this is a mission for a future market. And the zero debris approach will help generating this market. And only if we demonstrate that this mission can be repeated in an affordable way, will regulators follow the zero debris approach principles also beyond ESA. If you allow me, I would like to spend 1 or 2 words on space traffic management, which is an emerging topic today. From an engineering point of view, space traffic management would mean the means for a space operator to get into space, to operate in space, and to get back out of space without interference. And that translates for us from a technical standpoint into information that we need and guidance that we need for all other objects being in space. Space weather events, like a pilot checking the weather forecast before flight, we would check before critical operation, critical space weather events, so we need reliable forecast. We would do collision avoidance. We might want, or states might want to understand whether the objects under their jurisdiction are actually doing what is written in the national law. This requires surveillance. If an object gets lost, contact gets lost, and you want to know where it is and what the status is it tumbling, you want to take a recovery measure, you need space traffic management systems to tell you the whereabouts of your objects. And at the end of the mission, for an uncontrolled re-entry, you might even want to understand where it falls. Now, collision avoidance is a key thing here. And collision avoidance is something that changes in these days. For collision avoidance, it used to be normal to avoid fragments. And this diagram shows you all the objects we have avoided with ESA missions over the past 5 years. And you see since recent years, we are avoiding other active satellites. Half of the cases are actually going back to alerts triggered by other active satellites, which means another component of space traffic management, which is coordination between 2 operators. You cannot decide unilaterally on it, or you cannot rely on the other without coordinating and talking, and the technical means for that are not available, and they need to be brought about. The space surveillance information that is an absolutely essential input to space traffic management would need, from our perspective, become more accurate. Not only see more objects, but have information on the object that we already know more accurately. Because the more accurate the information is, and that is what I tried to show in this diagram, if you move to the left, it means we are getting more accurate with the information. The number of collision avoidance alerts goes down. To give you an idea, we receive for the 20 ESA spacecraft several hundreds of alerts every day. That's not bearable. In particular, when you have to coordinate with other operators manually, that will not work. So we need more accurate information, because then you have less false alerts. You only see the critical cases, and that will reduce the workload for the benefits of all. Last thought and last slide is a bit of more academic attempt of looking into the future use of space. Now we see that we are using space, portions of space, very heavily. And issues like interference apply also to spaceflight, not only in terms of frequency management, but also even in terms of physical interference. And we know that we give each other quite generous access to space, and I think that's a good value. We want to allow missions to come into space, but we realize that there's a limit. There's apparently a capacity limit that space has, and that makes space a resource, a scarce resource, and other scarce resources are managed. For example, the frequency spectrum is something that is managed. Everybody understands launching a new spacecraft will use the frequency, and it makes sense to coordinate with others to see if I can sort of make more room for others, or if I can launch later, or if I can limit anyway, to make everything possible to fit everybody in. And that's normal for frequency management, but for the management, for the use of space as such, it doesn't exist. And what we are working on is to find a way, a technical way, a mathematical description to make visible how much space is actually used by a mission. When this is available, and when this is carried by international consensus, this mathematical principle of describing how much space is used by a mission, it could be used as a future tool for coordination, not to prevent somebody from going into space, but for help coordinating using the space in a way that everybody fits in, and we do not suppress a mission because certain orbit slots are filled up. With this, I would like to close and thank very much for the opportunity to present here.
Thank you very much for this very, very interesting presentation. Exactly what we hoped for, that you give us a picture of the situation right now and the also increased risks in the last 2 years, and also ELSA-ESA's perspectives on how to address them. So very, very interesting. Thank you very much for this kickoff. And this brings me, reminds me to ask for questions on the audience, because perhaps some questions might already be raised by your presentation. Please write them in the chat, perhaps right now, so that you don't forget them, and we collect them and we'll answer them at the end. But perhaps this would be a good tool. Just write them down in the chat, and at the end we try to go to, and we know that to whom they are addressed. Perhaps you write also in the chat, this question goes to Holger, that we can then put it to him when we have the time at the end. Thank you very much indeed again. And I would now like to continue with the presentation by Natercia Rodrigues from UNOOSA. She is a program management officer at the United Office for Outer Space Affairs in Vienna. And she has an LLM degree from South Africa. But you have already a long experience in Vienna since 2012. So please share your screen if you, I think you have also prepared some slides, and I invite you to start with your presentations on the role of the UN Register in this context. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. I am not sure my camera is working. Can you see me?
Yes, it is working.
Oh, all right. So
very nice picture. Yes.
So it's just myself. Okay, there's no problem then. Just a quick question. Let me just launch this. There we go. So just a quick word about myself. I'm currently with the Office for Outer Space Affairs. I've been with the Office for Outer Space Affairs for a really, really long time. In my current role since 2012. I haven't worked on space workshops and such. I used to organize some of the space law workshops in the early days when UNOOSA started venturing in this round, and today I was reminded why those were so enjoyable. It's very nice to see a few familiar faces today. So my presentation really is focused on the identification of space objects and the role of the United Nations and the register. So what are the core functions that the Office for Outer Space Affairs has, other than looking after the needs and interests of member states during the intergovernmental meetings every year, is the maintenance of the United Nations Register of Objects and Launch into Outer Space. The main purpose really is for the identification of those space objects. It's one of the issues that was of the earliest concerns member states all the way back in the 60s, with, I suppose, an ancillary objective to identify the responsible state in that connection. I'm going to go through this very fast because most of you are aware of this information. So just a quick overview. What is a space object in the context of the register? We focus obviously on what's in the registration convention mainly. That gives us some parameters and some guidance on that, namely component parts of a space object as well as its launch vehicle and parts thereof. This basically translates in practice to operational satellites being registered with us, failed satellites, rocket stages, boosters, payload adapters, fairings, and also some space debris. The interpretation of what is a component part and what's launching a vehicle, it does differ from state to state. We do find different interpretations. For the purposes of the register, we often talk about functional and non-functional space objects. I won't address who's responsible. That's just the context as to why the registration is also quite important to us and to member states. Who registers? This is also defined by the registration convention, and there's some additional instruments that clarify this that the legal subcommittee adopted subsequently. Very simply, the register in the registration convention in Article 4 pretty much sets out what was needed to be provided to the United Nations in the submissions on registration of space objects and in terms of the timing. So this brings me actually to the point of the register and how mega constellations, the launching of mega constellations is impacting or being addressed or dealt with in the context of UN space objects being registered. This is just how we have identified the typical characteristics for mega constellations for the purposes of establishing what we would consider a large or a mega constellation. Anything between 100 and 1,000 objects are considered large constellations. With more than 1,000 objects, mega constellations. These are not established definitions. This is more or less the going data in terms of how to define these. Currently, we've got 3 mega constellations in play. We've got Starlink, OneWeb, and Kepler going up, and with OneWeb and Starlink having probably the most significant number of satellites currently in orbit. This is just a very quick demographic of what the number of objects launched and are in orbit. Very simple. I think Holger had a very, very nice representation of it, much more detailed. But just to give you a sense of what we are seeing in terms of registration, in 2021, we had about 1,800 satellites launched. 80% of these were part of the large or mega constellations that are currently being launched. The estimates based on filings and the general information in the public domain is that we may see as much as about 100,000 satellites being launched by 2032. So space object registration at the UN, I've already mentioned, we got over 1,800 functional objects registered last year. We had 41 that were non-functional registered, and we had 172 re-entry notifications provided to us. Comparatively, just this past May, we've already received registrations for 790 functional objects and 25 non-functional objects, and we, based on the trends at the moment, we're expecting that by the year end, we probably will see more than 2,000 objects being registered with the United Nations. The most recent news, literally 2 days old, is that with 19 satellites that have just been registered from the Kepler constellation. So we were very pleased to see that come in the last few days. In terms of the committee, obviously, as the secretariat to the committee and the legal subcommittee, obviously we monitor the developments there. The issue of large constellations and mega constellations has been a matter of consideration of importance to the legal subcommittee for some time, I believe, so around 2015, 2016. It started to come on the agenda now, is quite an active part of some of the discussions and views of member states expressing themselves on this, particularly under the working group on the status and applications of the 5 United Nations treaties. Currently, there is a questionnaire that's been around for a little while, and within that questionnaire on the various treaties, they have already for some time embedded questions on registration and mega constellations. The summary of the views of member states, the latest summary of views of member states can be found in the document that I've indicated to you then. I've given you the link at the bottom of the page where you can find these. Also in 2022, the Secretariat responded to a request from the legal subcommittee to prepare a paper to have a look at the registration of large constellations and mega constellations, with an emphasis to see if we could see already emerging patterns or practices from member states with respect to registration. The document reviews those practices based on the information that we collected and provides some basic statistics. And I've given you the reference if you're interested in going to look more into what was delivered. Now, in summary, the general overview of those practices, and we don't have a lot. Let me stress, we don't have, as you saw, we spoke about the 3 constellations that are currently being launched and developed. In terms of registration, in other words, the information we're getting on terms of registration. So we looked at the practices of states with that regard between 2015 and 2021. In that period, we have approximately 5,000 satellites were launched. We noted that approximately 66% of those objects that are being launched are associated to large and mega constellations. Approximately 950 of these were in the range of smaller set of satellites going up at 100 to 1,000, and then the larger constellations, more than 2,350 of those objects are part of mega constellations. What is the status of the registration? There's some good news on this. There's quite a good response in terms of registration of the United Nations of these objects. Of the objects that are considered large constellations, 93% of those have been registered thus far. And the mega constellations, 94% of those objects have been launched. So that's a relatively good figure, generally, comparably. General practices of states in registering those constellations is really dependent on the volume of objects that are being registered. You know, if they're sending us submissions of a single or less than 20 satellites in a single submission, then the pattern of how the information is being provided to us is fairly similar. When there is more, so when member states are having to give us more information on more than 20 or so satellites, then we've noticed that there has been an increase by the relevant states to give us the submissions or the information more frequently. They've also taken advantage of providing it in more of a tabular spreadsheet format, so to avoid, well, for efficiency purpose, in order not to be having to produce 1 document per satellite, which I think would be terrible for the submitters as well as the receivers in that regard. Now, focusing on the practices that we were able to identify, and I stress that this is mostly coming from the UK and the US satellites. Both these member states are registering their satellites, the mega constellations. Both states have reviewed their registration packages and identified areas on how to improve the efficiency. We've also been quite regularly in contact with the colleagues who deal with this for their governments to try and support as much as possible the submissions and the processing of the related information. Some of the common practices that we've identified, I've already mentioned one of them, increased frequency of registration submissions. For example, the UK tends to send them really soon after launch. USA has much more of a pattern-based submission where they do it monthly, so very regularly. So on a monthly basis, we get registration submissions from the United States. And then, of course, the use of spreadsheets, which I've mentioned already. With respect to the orbital, the basic orbital parameters that are being provided to the UN, the UK usually puts in the final orbit and planned dates, planned information, and the US usually provides the initial orbital parameters. So additional information that we're also getting in those submissions is from the United Kingdom. We've noticed that they provide the date of when OneWeb satellite was deemed to be non-functional. The US provides dates of re-entry for the Starlink satellites that decay or deorbit. We were also asked what recommendations would the Secretariat make in terms of registering large numbers of satellites. they're very similar to those that are already existing in the treaties, very similar. There really should be no different. The information is the same. We're still recommending the use of the COSPA International Designator, the provision of a common name for the space object, the use of UTC time and date of launch and other times and dates, provision of expected date of when the object would achieve their operational orbit, information on the space object owner or operator. And then obviously we encourage additional information relating to the change of status of space objects, such as failure or re-entry. We would welcome very much additional information on the constellation itself. And then if there are a great number of satellites being registered in a single submission, then of course we're happy and encourage the use of a spreadsheet to facilitate the processing of the information. And I leave you at that. I just leave you with a final page on where you can find some of this information I've spoken to you about and related information. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Micro, Imgard. Imgard, you don't have the mic.
Yeah. Okay, so now I'm unmuted. I'm sorry, I didn't work to press the button. Thank you very much for this very interesting, very topical and new information about registration practice in view of the latest developments of large constellations and mega constellations, which we have been talking for quite some years now, and now it becomes a reality, and we will see how the consequences of this will be. Now it is my pleasure to ask Mahulena Hofmann for the floor. She's a full professor of the SES chair in satellite communications and media law at the University of Luxembourg, and a member of the board of directors of the International Institute of Space Law. And she will talk about sustainability aspects in the UN space treaties and the LTS guidelines. Mahulena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Imgard. Thank you for your kind invitation to give the legal aspect to these important developments. So how shall I proceed? After introduction, which will be very short, I will deal with the legal framework of the problems of sustainability. Then I would like to concentrate on the long-term sustainability guidelines before concluding. We don't have to go into the introduction. We were convincingly informed how the situation deteriorated in the last years. So let me to concentrate on the legal framework. What do the UN treaties say about the issue of sustainability, about the issue of the protection of environment? And again, I am not going into detail because the majority of those who are following this international workshop are aware about these aspects. So just in a shortcut.
Mahulena, sorry, can you start the slideshow? Does it work when you click slideshow at the top, and then if you...
I am in...
Because we see also your presenting mode, I think.
Yeah. I'm now in the UR screen sharing mode.
Yeah, but now, yeah, here you have the slideshow. We can see the arrow of your mouse, and slideshow is in the middle of the bottom of the top line. Here, yeah, no, on the left a little bit. Slideshow. I have the. Because we see your screen. Okay. And it shows slideshow in the middle. It would be a bit easier because the letters of the text are a little small. It could be better readable. Okay, so it's in the panel of the Zoom or? No, in yours, on your. Okay, now I see, yes. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much. So it's much easier to read for us. Thank you so
You're
much.
welcome. So what about the legal framework? So first, the UN international treaties. So of course, at that time when space activities started, it could not be envisaged that there will be an increasing problem of sustainability. So the Outer Space Treaty has an Article 9, which requires a due regard to the interests of other participants of space activities, which can be interpreted as giving the obligation to take into account also environmental and sustainability criteria. But they are not formulated as like this. There are two provisions which deal with the problems of contamination of outer space and of the Earth. But these two provisions are reduced or are interpreted mostly as regulating or prohibiting the biological contamination of outer space and of the Earth. Instrumental in setting up the criteria for the measures which have to be taken to prevent contamination are set up on a regular basis by the COSPAR, which is a non-governmental international organization which creates recommendatory standards for space activities. Then we have other space UN treaties, like the treaty for the agreement for the rescue of astronauts and space objects, which obliges the states to notify the space objects returned to the Earth. Then we have the Registration Convention, which obliges the state to register the launch space objects. And we have the Moon Agreement, which has several environmental provisions, but as we know, the Moon Agreement is binding 18 states only. What about recommendatory instruments? So there are several sets of important recommendatory instruments, like the standards of the International Standard Organization. I brought just two examples, like the number 24113, which deals with the prevention of creation of space debris, or 26900, which deals with the orbital data. Of course, we have the UN Space Debris Mitigation Standards, very important recommendatory instrument. And last but not least, we have the UN Long-Term Sustainability Guidelines, which we shall have a look in a bit more detail in a second. We should not forget that one important legal instrument in this framework is the national legislation. There are numerous examples of environmental provisions in several space laws, like the 2005 law of Belgium, 2006 of Netherlands, later Austria, Finland, or Portugal. Let us to have a look on the long-term sustainability guidelines. So how did they start to be prepared? So the first working group was established 2010 under the auspices, not the legal, but the scientific technical subcommittee of the UN COPUOS. In 6 years, this committee adopted the first set of 12 guidelines, and 2 years later, a consensus has been found on the preamble and 9 additional guidelines. In 2019, 21 voluntary guidelines were adopted by the UN COPUOS. And here I make the focus on the word voluntary. These guidelines are per se not legally binding if they were not transformed in the national legislation. In 2019, a new working group was established, again under the auspices of the Scientific Technical Subcommittee, which deals with the 7 further guidelines, which could not have been because of the lack consensus agreed upon earlier. Let's have a look on the content of these guidelines. So they are composed of 4 chapters, and because the scarcity of time, let us have a look on the chapter A, which deals with so-called policy and regulatory framework. But if you would be studying these guidelines, you would find a much bigger quantity of regulatory rules also in the B, C, and so on chapters. So how is the sustainability first defined? So these guidelines understand the sustainability of space activities as the ability to conduct space activities indefinitely in the future. The definition is longer. It incorporates also the issue of the benefits for other countries, but that's the core of this definition. Who are the addressees of these guidelines? So they are the states. It is important, they are not the national entities, they are not the operators, they are the states. And here you will see a short overview of this chapter A. I made those provisions blue, which are not part of the UN treaties. So which go behind the or above the provisions of the space treaties. So these guidelines first recommend that states adopt national regulatory framework which is supporting the sustainability of space activities. So the states should adopt national regulatory framework. Why is this provision going above the provisions of Outer Space Treaty? You know that Article 6 of Outer Space Treaty makes the state responsible for their national activities, but it does not say that the states have do so via national legislation. There are many countries like Germany, for instance, which are using other instruments and don't have adopted legal norms in this sense. The second provision which I have chosen for you is the recommendation how this national legislation should address the sustainability. So this national legislation should implement the space debris mitigation measures. It should address the risks to environment. The national legislation should require minimizing environmental damages and also recommends the states to use the standards of the International Standard Organization. Third, the guidelines speak about the supervision of non-governmental entities. And here we can discuss whether the core of this rule deals rather with supervision or authorization of space activities. So the national entities should, through their structure, their technical competencies, and the managerial procedure, ensure the sustainability of space activities. So here the burden is going to the authorization of space activities requiring fulfilling specific criteria on the part of the national operators. 4, the frequency spectrum should be used rationally. And you see that I haven't signalized it blue because there is the whole system of the ITU rules, Constitution, Convention, radio regulation, and many others, which are respected by the states, 193 member states of the ITU. And here, last but not least, they are these guidelines make recommendations on the registering of space objects, and we have heard already about some new developments. For instance, the guidelines recommend that the information is given to the UN system prior to launch, which is new. Until now, the states are required to deliver information after the launch. They should deliver the information on the change of the status. It's already in the registration convention, but also on the separation of smaller parts from the main space object. To save the time, let me to proceed to the conclusion, and I would be happy to respond all detailed questions in your questions in the discussion part. So first, my first conclusion is that the UN treaties are encompassing sustainability provisions, but these are of a general character. They are not detailed. And the good part of the UN treaty system is that these rules, albeit very general, are binding. In comparison to the UN treaties, the long-term sustainability guidelines are much more detailed. They go further than the UN space treaties, like in the area of supervision registration, but they have recommendatory character. So by their violation, the states are not facing international responsibility in the legal sense of the word. However, the recommendatory rules can be transformed into binding ones. And we saw it in other areas of international law. They can, for instance, develop into customary international law through opinion juris and through long-lasting practice. They can become part of national law through reception. And here I am happy that Jean-François Mayence is with us, because there is a new Belgium royal decree which is in detail implementing these sustainability conditions in its Article 8 dealing with the impact assessment. And they can become part of national law through adaptation, like it happened, for instance, in the 2020 Luxembourg Space Activity Act, which in its Article 6 to 11 encompasses very detailed conditions for authorization of the operators, which have to have specific structure, managerial resources, some technical capacities, and so on. And last but not least, there are some interesting developments to follow. More and more are important the standards of the International Standard Organization, which you can find on the website of the UNOOSA. And allow me to thank the organizers for this opportunity. Allow me also to use this opportunity for informing you that in a short time, our commentary to the Luxembourg space legislation is going to appear in the Kluwer editing publishing house, and we are very much looking forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mahulena. Brilliant overview of the most important legal aspects. So referring to the UN treaties and comparing them to the LTS guidelines and highlighting where there is some development and where we can witness some progress, perhaps also for the future, and recommendations for future national space legislators. If we do not achieve the new international treaties, at least we can go this path for the improvement of a better management of space activities and oversight. Thank you so much. Really very, very important contribution here. And let's say paving the way for our following speakers, Joanne Wheeler she's also a lawyer, so talking from the legal perspective, but now taking the position of a very important spacefaring nation, the United Kingdom, which was already mentioned previously by Natercia, and where she talked about the large number of registered objects by the United Kingdom recently. And so now she can present and will present the perspective of the United Kingdom in this context. Thank you. I will also, I just wanted to introduce, you have, Joanne Wheeler is managing partner at a law firm in the UK, Alden Legal, but she has experience also working with the European Space Agency and Ofcom, and has represented also United Kingdom in the COPUOS, but now she speaks as a solicitor, as a lawyer, independent lawyer, but still from the perspective of the United Kingdom. Please, Joanne, start with your presentation, and perhaps can you put on your video? I think I don't see you on the video.
I have my video on.
Yeah, now it is. Now I can see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Professor Marble, for organizing this. I will discuss a little bit about the UK's implementation of the LTS guidelines. First of all, awareness raising, capacity building related to the implementation of the LTS guidelines and the project sponsored by the UK. Then the approach of the UK to sustainability and the implementation of the guidelines. And lastly, a new concept that is about to be announced by the UK in regard to a space sustainability kite mark. But first of all, the awareness raising, capacity building related to the implementation of the LTS guidelines. So this is a project that was sponsored by the UK in partnership with the UNOOSA to promote space sustainability. And there are two main phases. Phase one, January last year, to identify examples of sustainable use of outer space through a series of events, workshops, a lot virtual, and outreach efforts, and encouraging actors to implement the guidelines. And then phase two, at the end of last year, in regard to production of an anonymized stakeholder study report on how UNCOPUOS member states implemented the LTS guidelines. And this pulled together the results of interviews conducted by UNOOSA with the member states, focusing on their experience implementing the guidelines. Now, the report will shortly be published prior to a summit for space sustainability in London on the 22nd of June of this month. Now, the UK is also discussing a potential phase three of the project with the UN, reinforcing the importance the UK attaches to UNCOPUOS and also sustainability work. Now, before I get on to the implementation of the guidelines per se, in the context of the UN and the UK's work on sustainability, there was a conference last January at the kickoff of phase one. And I just wanted to pick up on a few points because Simonetta De Pipo, the director of UNOOSA at the time, mentioned that the global space sector is moving faster than we could have imagined. And goodness, that's true, with over 80 space programs at the moment in 83 states now being involved in space activities. And of course, this figure, as we all know, will only grow. But what's really key here is the commercial sector, with government expenditures amounting to a much smaller proportion of overall space expenditure than we saw in the past. And it's the growth in those commercial activities, as we've heard in regard to, from Ms. Rodrigues, that is really making a big impact on orbital populations and the impact on sustainability in long-term space activities. And the dynamics, particularly over the last recent years, are changing, with new space nations joining the international space community, new categories of actors, non-state, large industrial players, startups, university, and the advent of large constellations, CubeSats and small launch facilities. And one thing that Simonetta De Pipo picked up that I strongly agree with is there's no substitute to a multi-stakeholder approach and a level playing field dedicated to sustainability of space and the need for the implementation of the LTS guidelines. So the guideline states that they should be implemented to the greatest extent feasible and practicable. And the UK take an outcomes-based approach to this and in regulation in general. And in this, the UK seeks to ensure the sustainable use of the space environment through licensing conditions primarily, trying to take a holistic approach to the outcomes-based approach, anticipating technology and regulatory changes and changes to orbital population, looking at the probability of loss, probability of damage, and now also quantum of the damage that could potentially be caused. Allowing and encouraging international collaboration and partnerships, and very importantly, engaging with industry, and including internationally, but while encouraging commercial growth and innovation and research. And it's important through all of this to create transparency to reduce investment risks in this. And we're seeing investors now look for compliance with sustainability guidelines, and I'll come on to that. And of course, the implementation needs to be accessible, also protect security interests, and be reasonable and proportionate. And we're even seeing that in the application of sustainability guidelines. Now, as Professor Hofmann said very, very clearly, she set out the UN guidelines and mentioned that many of these at IDC and ISO level are purely recommendatory, not legally binding under international law. And therefore, I've done in this triangle here just a note that, and just remind ourselves that although the UN guidelines are vital, LTS guidelines are vital, and IDC and ISO, they're all non-binding under international law. And therefore, the greatest extent feasible and practical for this implementation really is important, and also some homogeneous aspects of this implementation. So how are these implemented? The guidelines and standards can be called into contracts, including government procurement contracts, and implemented in national licensing conditions, for example. And that's how the UK primarily implement the LTS guidelines, the binding effect through licensing conditions. And we're seeing actually licensing conditions becoming much tighter in regard to sustainability requirements. Now, over the next few slides, I also look at how the UK is implementing the LTS guidelines by actually putting right at the top little brackets as to which LTS guidelines they're looking to implement. But let me pick up one in particular just now, guideline A3. In supervising space activities of non-governmental entities, states need to ensure that entities under their jurisdiction and control that conduct outer space activities have appropriate structures and procedures in place for planning and conducting space activities that support the objective of enhancing long-term sustainability, and that they have the means to comply with relevant national and international regulatory frameworks. And this goes to due diligence in regard to those national entities. So the UK, in supervising private commercial space activities, therefore, looks at assessing the entities and licensees and whether they have appropriate corporate, commercial, and technical structures and procedures in place to conduct those space activities safely and appropriately. The structures also and procedures to support the objective of long-term space sustainability, and that the licensees have the means, including the financial, and more recently, really focus on the management means to comply with national and international regulatory frameworks. And in short, this is my cheese board summary of how the UK approaches the LTS guidelines in all of this application. It balances, of course, government risks, safety, security, and sustainable use of space, but still to encourage commercialization, innovation, and growth through the UK and elsewhere. So there's 8 boxes here. Yes, looking at the sustainable use of spectrum and international and compliance with international and European laws. Look at the insurance obligations and make sure that third-party liability insurance is adequately taken out. Now more than ever, looking at the financial standing, particularly of constellations, the corporate standing and the management expertise. Does the licensee have relevant management heritage to conduct these obligations? Look at international security requirements, going around policy requirements, and maintenance of UK's international reputation, technical assessment, increasingly focusing on space debris and sustainability guidelines, commercial assessment as to where the liability lies to, and lastly, more than we've seen ever before, space debris and sustainability guidelines and compliance with them. Let me just focus a little bit more on the technical structures that the UK would assess. Number one, can the applicant safely conduct the launch into orbit of the proposed vehicle and the payload platform? Does it understand the hazards involved? We need to evidence, and I had many emails this morning in this regard, of evidence how the operations can be performed safely and sustainability, not just how, but the evidence behind that. What is the thought process that's actually gone into establishing that conclusion, and demonstrate that commercial launch and operations pose no unacceptable threat to the public. Then also looking at the considerations for liability risk in operation. What is the possibility of encountering another object, probability of a collision occurring, and the likelihood of resulting damage claim, and even now the quantum, potential quantum of that claim. And then for in-orbit phase assessment, the ejection phase, looking at the ejection of platforms from the launch vehicle, orbit raising phase, and particular detail in regard to constellations here. Criteria to initiate the orbital raising phase, who commands and monitors, and remember also, do they have the heritage to be and the experience to do that, and how is it performed? And particularly in constellation maintenance. Now let me pick up on something that Dr. Krag also mentioned here. What we're seeing also in the UK is not just how the constellation is maintained, but what about disposal and the demise of the satellites? And increasingly, we're now looking at engagement in regard to active debris removal. If there is a defunct satellite, a failed satellite, not right at this moment, but looking increasingly and working with astroscale, clear space, etc., can that satellite be removed from orbit? And ESA are sponsoring some excellent studies in this regard. And that relates, of course, to the next point, planned and unplanned disposal and the mechanism for disposal and to manage conjunctions. So we're seeing increasing look now in regard to not just in-orbit servicing, but increasingly active debris removal. Now, continuing the theme of space sustainability and the compliance with LTS guidelines, the Science Minister presently in the UK, Minister Freeman, is looking at a UK sustainability kite mark to take LTS guidelines, make sure that these are complied with even more robustly. And this kite mark, just very quickly, would be an industry-led sustainable kite mark, but looking at industry, not just in the UK, but across the world, but also very importantly, engagement with academia. Not just in the UK, but also elsewhere, devised by industry in collaboration with the UK Civil Aviation Authority, because it has to be implementable, and to cover taking a holistic approach to the life cycle of a satellite, all aspects of design, manufacture, launch, operation, demise of satellites, taking into account ISO, IDC standards, the space sustainability rating, and very, very importantly, the LTS guidelines, providing that consolidated standard. And compliance with international evidence in compliance with international sustainability best practice, and looking at whether we can actually establish a British Standards Institute kite mark on this. The table below on this slide just shows you exactly what this kite mark will cover, and it really is all encompassing. It's not an easy kite mark, and there'll be likely 14 separate boxes of assessments to be done in this regard. But why the kite mark? Because sustainability is quite honestly so vital. The LTS guidelines are a vital component of this. And we're seeing investors in financial markets increasingly requiring compliance with environmental, social, and governance aspects when they're investing in private activities, including space activities. And a kite mark and that stamp of, yes, we comply with ISO, IDC, and LTS guidelines as a stamp of confidence to investors. The compliance with the kite mark and also the LTS guidelines will also, by the end of this year, be linked in the UK with different liability bands and different bands in regard to insurance, so lower bands when sustainability compliance is met. And we're seeing increasingly that the compliance with sustainability guidelines and license conditions offer market access elsewhere in the US, but also in other countries. So slowly there's an ecosystem developing in regard to finance, insurance, liability, market access, and of course reputation of not just the regulator, but the companies with that kite mark standard. So the kite mark is likely to be announced on the 23rd of June, so this month, actually, at the Space Sustainability Summit. And very importantly, a kite mark doesn't work if it's purely national. It needs to be international in scope and global. So I really, really hope that I can work with many of you in academia and in industry across the globe to pull this together. That's all from me. And Professor Marbo, thank you so much for letting me speak.
Oh, thank you so much for this very interesting and a detailed presentation, and gave us very important insights into what's going on in the UK. And it became very clear from your presentation that you, and I forgot to mention, you're sitting on the Executive Council of the UK industry body UK Space and the Space Sector Council. So you present, let's say, a little bit the other side of the medal here. So not the legislator, not the official government body, but industry in your capacity and as a legal advisor, but to industry. Previously, it was more governmental organizations, but now it's indeed the industry. But you see, you showed us very impressively how important also the legal framework is for industry, for building confidence, but that the standards are developed in cooperation or even led by industry, not only in cooperation, but coming from industry. So eventually developing in some legal standard, a legally relevant standard at least. Thank you so much. Very, very insightful presentation too. Now I see Tanja has already activated her camera. Thanks, Tanja Masson-Zwaan. Everyone knows Tanja, of course, she needs no introduction, but just to remind you that she's assistant professor, deputy director of the International Institute of Air and Space Law in Leiden at the University of Leiden, and president emerita of the International Institute of Space Law. Of course, she was also a co-founder of the Hague Space Resources Governance Working Group, but today she will talk about something totally different, namely the Spaceways project. Please, Tanja.
Thank you so much, Irmgard, and thank you for inviting me also to the NPOC of ECSL in Austria and Austrian Ministry for Climate Action. I'm happy to share some information and some thoughts about the Spaceways project. Let me just add that I make these remarks in my personal capacity. The project is still currently ongoing and results are not made public yet. So with that caveat, I'm happy to share some thoughts here. Let me see just if I can pass the slide. So first of all, we have been talking about long-term sustainability and how does space traffic management fit in there. We all have seen from previous speakers that space is a shared environment that is more and more contested, congested, and so on, and that we really need shared solutions at a global level, ideally to solve those, to address those. And space traffic management is indeed one of the tools, an important tool to achieve safety, sustainability, and security of space operations. Of course, if we have isolated space traffic management systems all over the world, that will not help because then there is no compatibility between these systems. So a global STM strategy is important. That doesn't mean that national efforts are not also important, and the efforts of space agencies and industry are all contributing to this, to achieving this. However, at the moment, there is not yet any common approach that is existing among nations, and although several states, of course, led by the United States with Space Policy Directive number 3 of 2018 and extensive data networks and SST networks is leading the way. But the European Union also has a role to play, and that is what these projects are about. For Europe, for the European Union, having a strong space traffic management system is important, because we need to find our voice in this global debate. And as perhaps many of you have seen, the European Commission, together with the European External Action Service, has issued a joint communication last February on an EU approach for space traffic management. The background of this is the growing importance of the Galileo and Copernicus program and the new secure connectivity system. Also the fact that a large percentage, 10% of the total GDP of the EU is enabled by satellite navigation, that the EU currently has more than 30 satellites in orbit, and that there is a 14 billion plus investment in space programs in the current financial program. Of course, there is already an EU SST consortium that is now evolving into an SST partnership involving more EU member states that already is providing services to 250 satellites plus. And SST is, as you will no doubt appreciate, an important component of an STM system. So that means the EU already has assets in place to make this happen. So the Spaceways project is one of actually 2 Horizon 2020 funded programs currently underway. Our project is called Spaceways, and it will be ending at the end of this month. And the idea is that we wanted to assess the technical and policy related issues about space traffic management and come up with a set of recommendations and actions for EU stakeholders. To understand really the context of STM, both in the international and the domestic domains, and really to focus on, first of all, what are the capabilities in Europe and what are the gaps, what can we do, what do we not yet do well, and what are the policy, legal, and economic aspects. So in the end, we hope to be providing concrete recommendations and guidelines to the European Commission. We really wanted to create also a link between the needs of the stakeholders and the various communities to assess European technical capabilities with respect to STM, to assess again the legal policy and economic framework, propose guidelines and best practices, and also disseminate the guidelines and recommendations that will be published. So this will be part of the work once the project ends, but as I said at the time, it is still ongoing. Really, the aim is to come up with a set of actionable and impactful recommendations. And those 2 words are important. They have to be concrete and they have to really have an impact. And so there can be, there can be several levels of recommendations that we might bring to the European Commission. I will pass to the next slide to show you the partners that are have been working since last January 2021 on this project. As you see, they are industry, they are research institutes, they are various countries are represented, and with the University of Leiden, we have been in charge together with KU Leuven and also SP, European Space Policy Institute, of some of the most of the legal work and involved in formulating the recommendations that we're currently finalizing. I think an important aspect of this project is that it was really important to involve the entire stakeholder community, especially external stakeholders. And so there has been an extensive stakeholder engagement program that we had set up, which resulted in 6 workshops over the past year and a half, where we had many participants from different European entities, both governments, ministries, international organizations, and of course representatives from the European Union itself, satellite operators, SST service providers, and research and development entities such as small, medium entities, startups, and a non-profit organization. So really quite a wide involvement of the stakeholder community, against whom we have been testing our findings and our recommendations and taking their feedback on board to come with really valuable conclusions. Just to zoom in a little bit on the work that I, with the University of Leiden, with my colleagues, have been most involved with, that was to really assess the legal policy and economic framework. So there were actually 4 parts in this work package. First dealing with the legal aspects, then one package dealing with the policy aspects, one package with dealing the economic aspects, and then there was one package that dealt with a comparison of air traffic management, which of course has certain similarities, but also many differences with future space traffic management systems. In terms of the legal framework that we analyzed, because that is the main topic of this workshop, of course, we really started with setting the scene, meaning looking at the changed landscape. We've heard from various speakers here before about the new space, the large constellations, many more commercial actors, many more countries involved in the space scene, which has an effect on how we manage space. We've also made some comparisons with maritime law and aviation law to look at what can we compare and what can we not compare, and came with some conclusions on that. We did, of course, the whole analysis of the legal framework, both in terms of hard law and soft law, looked at the treaties, looked at the guidelines, but also looked at, did an extensive analysis of national development. So we made a questionnaire that we sent around to some of you in this workshop, actually also to ask what is being done in terms of space traffic management. Are there plans to include this in the national legal framework, and so on. And that gave us an interesting overview of many initiatives, especially in the field of debris, but not yet very many concrete plans for space traffic management regulations. We also looked at other actors, and some of them were also mentioned by previous speakers, the IADC, the CCSDS, and also the various industry initiatives such as the Paris Peace Forum, Net Zero Space, or the World Economic Forum with the Space Sustainability Rating and similar initiatives, which really show an interest from the industry. So the bottom-up approach of realizing that this is now time to address this topic. So even though we saw that some elements were present, it is clearly needed to do further action to come with a comprehensive framework. And the idea is really that the European Union can play a role in that process. So to give you just a few concluding remarks, and as I said, the conclusions and recommendations have not been finalized. So I'm again making these in my personal capacity. But much of this is actually already present in the joint communication that I mentioned earlier, and one of those is definitely that the European Union should be a strong actor in the European space, in the international space law arena. For instance, by showing its acceptance of international law, by making declarations of acceptance of the treaties, but also contributing actively in the discussions on the guidelines, implementation of the guidelines, and so on. It really needs to reinforce its image as a credible partner, an important partner on the international stage. And I think that also playing that role within UN COPOS is important. We know that space traffic management is a topic in the legal subcommittee, whereas long-term sustainability is, of course, being discussed in the scientific and technical subcommittee. So these are important platforms for multilateral coordination, whereas at the same time, bilateral or parallel discussions with interested states will also help in attaining multilateral agreement. And there is absolutely an environment to realize this, because the European Union since few years is a permanent observer in COPOS. Most members of the EU are member of COPOS, and most have ratified the main space treaties. Of course, also the role of ESA is extremely important, and we've seen what ESA is doing in Holger Krag's presentation, and definitely the coordination between the two separate international organizations is necessary and important. So in the end, towards the end of this month, we're going to conclude this project with hopefully these so-called actionable and impactful recommendations. And I hope to have given you a little flavor of the work we have been doing, and happy to take any questions if there are any. There are various ways to keep informed about the project on Twitter, LinkedIn, various videos on YouTube, and the website is here on the slide, and there is already one, I believe, STM briefs, a kind of newsletter. The next one is coming up, and that will also give some idea of the work that is being done in this project. So Irmgard, over to you. Thank you very much for listening, and I stop the sharing here.
Thank you very much. Fascinating, and I will not comment on various aspects, but so many comments and questions and highlights which have been presented here. But I have to look at the watch, and I realize that we have only 25 minutes left. We have 2 speakers left. I would like to ask Jean-François, yes, to share his screen. Thank you very much again, Tanja. And now we give the floor to Jean-François. And as I see in the chat, there is already quite a lively discussion. Perhaps I encourage also others to put their questions directly in the chat, because in view of the time, probably we will have only a very short round of questions at the end, as we hope to have, but I think it's really fascinating to listen to all these presentations, and they are anyway very disciplined. But you can use the chat and put these questions, and I've seen Joanne. Thank you very much for answering and making this effort of answering the questions already. Perhaps this is a solution to a way out of our dilemma that we have 2 more speakers, but only 25 minutes left. So Jean-François, without further ado, is a legal advisor at the Belgian Federal Office for Science Policy, BELSPO, and a regular member of the Belgian delegation. I know him in several international organizations, the United Nations, EU, and ESA, and he is the author of the Belgian space law and the 2008 implementation decree. So Jean-François, it's great to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Irmgard. Thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to discuss those very interesting and important subjects. So I just wanted to go straight to the to the topic, if you allow me. Do you see my presentation? Is it okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay,
perfect.
Thank you. So just to give you a glimpse of what the legal framework and the context of the space activities in Belgium are, we have a national space legislation which was adopted in 2005. And it was revised in 2013. It was revised notably to take into account the special case of non-maneuverable satellites, which were, let's say, the most common satellites we have to deal with in Belgium. And it was implemented by a regulation which was adopted in 2008, the first one. And I'm very pleased that I'm now talking in this month of June to present the brand new implementing regulation, which was adopted in March of this year. So this new regulation also allowed us to take into account to some extent the implementation of the long-term sustainability guidelines as adopted by COP-WAS. Belgium is often described as the smallest of the big European space nation, or the biggest of the small, that depends on the point of view, whatever you want. That means an investment, a public investment per year of 270 million euros in support of space R&D, mainly through ESA. And since 2014, we have had 7 national activities. 6 were authorized in accordance with the Belgian space law, and 1 was didn't need to be authorized because it was a governmental activity involving two CubeSats. We have registered so far 36 objects, and so we of course have, as you can see, we have activities which have involved several objects each. So you can find the registry and not only the Belgian register for space objects, but also the let's say the compilation, the repertory, I would say, of the authorization delivered by the minister. You can find them on the website, which is there, www.belspo.be. If you go to the space law page, it's interesting to see the content of the file, the application file, which is submitted by the operator. We try to ensure full transparency. Of course, there are some information which are not published, but you can see, for instance, all the documents which were provided by the operator in terms of technical assessment, but also technical description in support of his application. I mentioned that because I think that transparency is one of the first steps towards long-term sustainability. I think it's an important thing that we are using open access tools to provide the necessary information to what is authorized or what is not authorized by the Belgian government. And I think it is important to mention it. So the INCOPWOS guidelines, of course, that was a big achievement. And I don't want, of course, I don't have the time to go through the whole description of the implementation through not only the Belgian space law, but also the Belgian space regulation and the Belgian space policy of all the measures, the provisions, the principles that we have in Belgium to implement those guidelines. Actually, that's what we have done in the framework of COPWOS. And if you are interested, you can check the document with the reference which is mentioned there. It's a 2021 document, CRP 12. You can find it on the UNCOPWOS website. And you will find actually a synoptical table with in one column all the guidelines, and in the other column you will see all the implementation measures or provisions which are applicable in Belgium and which are implementing those guidelines. So of course I cannot review them as a whole because it will take something like 2 hours, but please have a look, and you will see how a small country like Belgium can implement those guidelines. I think it's important. I always mention the relevance of Belgium, not because I'm from Belgium, but because I think it's somehow a good example of what this kind of country, which is active in space, but which remain a small nation without any launch capacity, without any launcher operator, what this kind of countries can do to implement those guidelines and share its part of the burden of the effort, I would say, in making space more sustainable. Just to give you very briefly the highlights of this document in terms of implementing the LTS guidelines. Well, thanks to Mahulena, who very kindly previously mentioned the Belgian space law and the environmental impact assessment. We have indeed that system, and that dates back to the origin of the Belgian space law in 2005, the system of environmental impact assessment. I put a little S between brackets here because there is one which is mandatory by law, and there might be other impact assessment to be carried on further during the course of the activities at the request of the minister, only at the request of the minister. The first one anyway is mandatory. It has to be joined to the application for the authorization. The impact assessment must cover not only the orbital impact, but also the ground impact. And I mentioned that because it's becoming more and more important, and I see more and more in the press articles about the impact, the environment impact of the launching activities. Again, that's not really what happens in Belgium, but that does not mean that Belgium should not care for that kind of impact, even if it's on foreign territory or in international waters, for instance. We have to assess that impact, and we have to make sure that it's proportionate to the benefit of the activity. That's actually what the assessment is for. That actually it's interesting to see that for the moment, if I'm not mistaken, the European Union legislation and directive of 2011 as revised in 2014, I think, and which deals with environmental impact assessment, does not cover the the space launch sector. Maybe it will be an evolution in the future. I don't know. Maybe it will be worth discussing about that at European level. But for the moment, it's true that it's only under Belgian space law that you can find this extension to this kind of activity. Orbital impact, of course, includes space debris mitigation, compliance with NPS, so nuclear power source guidelines, and of course, compliance with long-term sustainability guidelines. There is also in the law the obligation, not the obligation, sorry, the possibility for the minister to impose a technical review by ESA, so that, of course, Belgium has having no national space agency or technical authority able to assess the technical aspects of an activity. It has to rely to its own, I would say, its national space agency, which is actually ESA in that case. And ESA is doing that service for Belgium under a special agreement, which is, of course, very important for a country like Belgium. There is also the possibility to substitute an operator to a faulty or bankrupt operator. This is something which is not usual. But we thought that it was important to that, since you can have satellite in orbit during years, the economic life of the operator is not necessarily the same as the in-orbit life of the satellite, and it's important to make sure that there is someone in charge of the operation. And also, we want to mention the agreement we have with the US Spacecom. It was US Stratcom before that, but we have an agreement allowing us to provide data at the moment of the launch, and that is also very useful, very appreciated by Belgium, that we have the cooperation from the US partner in this monitoring of on-orbit satellites for the moment they are positioned in orbit. So it's also very important, since we do not have that capacity at national level. So what is new in 2022? What can I present as new things happening under the Belgian space law? First, we have, of course, we have this new royal decree, which was adopted in 2022, and we have now a specific provision that includes in the environmental impact assessment, the one which has to be performed at the very beginning, sorry, not at the beginning, sorry, prior to the authorization, which has to be joined to the application. We have a new item, which is the assessment of the impact on space resources, in the case, of course, that such resources would be involved in the use of space resource would be involved in the activity. For the moment, we do not have any activity involving space resources, at least the space resources like we are talking about in the UN for the moment. I'm not talking about the orbit because that and the radio frequency, because that is of course dealt through our telecommunication authority. But for mineral resources, for instance, we have this possibility to ask the operator who would like to get involved in that kind of activity to perform an impact assessment on the exploitation of those resources or the use of those resources. We have also, now that is new, I said that prior in my previous slide, that there was a technical review which could be performed by ESA at the request of the minister. Now it's actually becoming mandatory, so the minister has no choice. It has to be done for CubeSat class objects, and especially those which are not maneuverable, because in that case we would like to have the assessment, technical assessment from ESA that the CubeSat class object is compliant with all the norms which are applicable. There are exceptions to that. I will not mention them, but in certain cases that review is not mandatory. But this is certainly true for what I would call the newcomers, like university who want to launch a CubeSat and which are not usual operators. So we also have something which is totally, let's say, specific to Belgium. We have now elected criteria which allow us to register objects which are launched under procurement by non-governmental activities. That was
Excuse
something.
me, Jean-François. I think we must look at the time.
Yes.
Perhaps you can come to an end, but I would also like to highlight that the last question you addressed is also referring to a question of our guest, Sophie Hofmann, who directed the question to Mr. Krag. To what extent can ESA help and provide assistance for member states regarding technical expertise? I think this is exactly what you mentioned here in your slide. So perhaps this answers a little bit already the question of Sophie Hofmann, because I think we will not have time to. I would like to give the floor to Holger at the end, but we have on less than 10 minutes left, and I think I'm afraid that we must be very brief here. Okay. But thank you very much for highlighting that Belgium has already achieved such assistance apparently, and perhaps you can communicate with each other how you did that and how this would be also a path forward for other countries.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. So would this be your final slide or final comment?
That was my final slide, actually. That was the fifth one. No, just it was just to say we do not have this kind of application for the moment in Belgium, but I was wondering what we would do facing an application for a mega constellation, and I just I just wanted to add those 4 possibilities. Frankly speaking, I don't know which one we would choose, but I think that I would hope that it would be between C and D. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is very thoughtful and you know, thought-provoking also. Thank you very much. And now it is my great pleasure, and apologies for Ryan that I kept you waiting. We were a little bit delayed, but of course you will have your 10 or 12 minutes for your presentation, but I must apologize, I think, to the participants that the question and answer session and discussion will have no time, but I see that there is a lively chat discussion, and please use that tool for exchanging views and concerns. But now I would like to give the floor to Ryan. He works in an Office of Space Affairs at the US Department of State, and he serves as the office's lead on the guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities, engagement with UN COPOA, space traffic management, and space situational awareness issues and space hazards. Importantly, he maintains the US Registry of Space Objects. So please, Ryan, the floor is yours.
I'll just open by thanking you so much for inviting me here today, and I'm happy to do some kind of creative trimming as I go along. So maybe we will have a little time at the end.
Good. Thanks. Do we have some? Now it is frozen a bit, the video. Yeah. No?
I think Jean-François has to stop sharing his screen.
Yeah, please, Jean-François, yes. Now? Yeah, now we have no screen sharing, and perhaps Ryan can try. I hope he's still with us. Yes, but no video yet. So indeed, Jean-François' video was stable, even though you feared some connection problems, but we did not see until now. We have had no connection problems. Ryan, where are you? Actually, I just before, when we met in the room before, he said he's not in the US, but in Vienna, actually, close to the UN, because he's representing currently the United States government in the session of UN COPUOS. So the Atlantic is not the reason why the connection has some problems, as I realize. Perhaps Ryan, can you write in the chat if you are here? Hello? Okay. Bitten Ton einzuschalten. But I think you're, I think now he is lost. So perhaps you will reconnect. So I would like to perhaps go to some of these questions, which are now the question and answer session is going on. And I thank very much Holger, Krag, that you answered already some of the questions which were put to you. Multitasking here. Watching, listening, and writing, reading and writing. Thank you very much. So I don't know what, I hope that I look at my email, perhaps he's writing. Because until just now he was here. The connection between the University of Vienna and the region beyond the Danube, as we call it, seems to be not the best. Perhaps it would have been easier that he had connected from the United States. Usually this works. Oh, I'm so sorry. Keeping you waiting here. And I write him an email. Okay, so I think some users are already also leaving, and we have just now met our time limit actually. So I understand that people who have a tight schedule and other commitments are starting to leave. Anyone, any news from Ryan?
Is it perhaps an idea to share his presentation later?
Yeah. Yes, that's a good idea. Thank you, Tanja. Because I got it today from him, and I have it, of course, so I share it. Yeah. Oh. Was brief, Ryan.
I didn't mean necessarily now, but perhaps also if you publish it on the website.
Yeah.
Probably a connection issue.
He wrote me today that he has a few slides, but they are not quite ready to send yet. But I wanted to give you advance notice to announce slides, but I haven't got them so far. But yes, that would be probably the only solution we have. I will share the slides. He promised to send slides. He has written that he has prepared slides, and we will have a good overview, I'm sure, about the US position. It's a very unfortunate, but also we are running out of time. And I see that you took the opportunity to exchange questions and answers on the chat. I highly appreciate your flexibility in this regard. Thank you very much to all the presenters. It was really inspiring, so high level, very thoughtful, thought-provoking in presentations. And I thank you very much for having accepted our invitation to this event. I thank the co-organizer, the Ministry for Climate Action. I thank the University of Vienna, who is also supporting the National Point of Contact for Space Law. And I look forward to seeing you hopefully soon again in a personal format when we finally increasingly get back to the traditional format of our conferences. We would have offered you, of course, some drinks and some sandwiches to sit together and talk a bit, but this has to be also postponed for the next time. Thank you very much again for joining, and I wish you all the best and hope to see you soon in Vienna or elsewhere. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Irmgard. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for an excellent event. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.